Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m. It is definitely still 1 p.m. both here in the building and live online. So whether you're in Bristol or you're far away, you can join in the conversation. So my name's Martin O'Leary. I'm the studio community lead here at the Pervasive Media Studio. I'm a white man in my 40s with long hair and a beard wearing a geometric pattern t-shirt. And every Friday we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend some time in our space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So especially big welcome to anyone who's new to the studio. Can anyone who's new to the studio put their hand up? Oh, we've got quite a few today. Welcome all. What is the Pervasive Media Studio? This bit's for you. We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. And we're a partnership between Watershed, where we are right now, UE Bristol and the University of Bristol, and we're funded by Arts Council England. And what we do is we offer studio space, including desks, meeting rooms, events, and opportunities, all for free to our residents as part of a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. And most of all, we're a space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make some time for collaboration. So a few notes before we begin. Please do feel free to move around. We're fairly relaxed today. Kitchen is back there. You can grab a cup of tea or coffee or some water. Milk's in the fridge. If you need to take a break at any point, there is a quiet space just next to us, to my left, to your right. So just around the corner there. It's fairly well soundproofed, so if you need to go and take a break, just feel free. We are not expecting a fire alarm today. If you hear a fire alarm, that's probably real, and we're going to usher you out of the building. The studio team will tell you where to go, but in any event, the fire exits are at the other end of the studio. Again, my left, your right, at either side. And there are accessible toilets, including baby change, in the corridor over there next to the kitchen. So there'll be a Q&A at the end of the talk. For those of you who are watching online, you can pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Lautim is here. He will be your voice in the room. If you're in the room, you can stick your hand up and we'll send a microphone so the folks at home can hear what you have to say. You can get news on all of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PM Studio UK on Twitter, at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon, or at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. All right, our speaker for today is George Magner. George is a filmmaker, creative learning facilitator, and studio resident. His project, Our Lives Inside, is a series of research-led audiovisual projects telling the stories of imprisoned people through their own prisms of experience. I just noticed that has prison and prism in the same sentence, which is probably not great writing. Today he's going to talk about how he's tried to develop an ethical framework of co-authorship in order to build a safe, equitable space for the imprisoned participants and eventually audiences to fill. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to George.
Well, thank you very much, and apologies for the tongue twister to kick off, Martin. Yeah, this is typically a talk that is used to share and celebrate achievements, but today I'm more here in the spirit of setting things in motion. So you've heard a bit about me. My name is George. I'm a filmmaker and a creative learning facilitator, and I'm in the midst of a series of projects that I'm grouping under the banner Our Lives Inside. That is a project designed to help create, facilitate, and co-author storytelling with people whose lives are spent in prison. My primary partners on this project, Dr. Susie Hulley, Dr. Maria Adams, and their research teams from the Universities of Cambridge and of Surrey. My production company, which I run most of my work through, is Mountain Way Pictures. And we have partnerships for our existing projects with Cambridge Creative Encounters, which is a programme organised by the University of Cambridge's Public Engagement Forum. And we're in the early stages of establishing a partnership with the Prison Reform Trust. These are the people who are helping me facilitate my work. Now, just as a general note, I speak as an independent practitioner and not as an ambassador for any of my partners. I hope I get it all right. So, Our Lives Inside. It's a continuum of research-led audio-visual art projects told via the prisms of experience of imprisoned people. Now, what does that actually mean? It means that these are projects that are grounded in research, created in partnership with researchers, and that research stems from qualitative, longitudinal surveys carried out with multiple cohorts of people serving very long sentences in prison. This is something that I've been developing for a couple of years, and it's something that sort of coalesced out of a string of projects that I have been working on, which sort of started to come together quite organically, where I started to recognize a really exciting opportunity to create narrative treatments of real stories that involved the subjects that we were telling the stories about as storytellers within the project. So our projects have become vehicles for subjects to become narrators of their own stories, and this is something that we can't always take for granted. So the first of these projects that really sort of gave me the germ for the idea is this one here. It's a project called Skipping Lunch that I was invited into by writer and dramaturg Ruby Lawrence. Ruby at the time worked with a care leavers charity, and she was motivated to create a film response to her work with adult care leavers who are spat out into the adult world, having endured a very sort of turbulent and disorganized childhood, and working with Lily here, who is a former care leaver herself, and taking her story of having to find her way in the world and find work and dealing with this insane contrast of demands on her to sort of fit in to the world and not stand out and not appear different, which she describes as one of the sort of highest desires for her as a young adult in the world. Our story told the journey of her going to her first job interview, and this was a make or break moment for her. She was quite literally on the poverty line, and this strange rupture between having to stand out and be the best, the best candidate in the room versus her innate desire to fit in and sort of disappear into the system was really, really extraordinary as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, to try and dig my teeth into and do justice to. And we were extraordinarily privileged to have Lily herself appearing as our lead actor. So growing out of this, I started to develop a sort of a chain of work, trying to involve other participants in the telling of their own stories. So the next of these was a charity promo, again, called Discover Ealing Anchor, and this was working with the parents of young SEND children in the very early stages of receiving a diagnosis, of exploring pathways of specialist provision in the Ealing area of London. And that was a really, really enriching project to be a part of because it was grounded in the experiences of the service users. So both behind the camera and in front of the camera. This is a young service user called James. He's in the early stages of his journey in autism. His mother, Serena, is a mum of 3, 2 of whom have special educational needs. And they, as a family, were front and centre in the development, the scripting, and then the performance of the project. And the script for the project was 100% verbatim, drawn from transcripts generated from workshops with the parents of the children using the system. And then most recently, at the start of the year, we completed a project working with Out of the Can, who are an LGBTQ youth group based in Swindon. So they are a pretty unique organisation in the Swindon area and a real sort of community hub. They wanted to commission a film to drive recruitment, to invite new members into the community, but they were really, really keen as well for participants to be front and centre in the film. So through an 8-week workshop programme, we grounded them in the principles of filmmaking, but also developed the story alongside them. The outcome being that the participants formed just under 100% of the crew and the cast. They represented themselves. They were intrinsic to the writing and the telling of their own story. So that's the sort of the lead up to the work I'm really here to talk about today. In 2021, I was commissioned by Cambridge University to work with an award-winning team of researchers who had authored this book, Life, Imprisonment from Young Adulthood, Adaptation, Identity and Time. So this is a really extraordinary piece of research that is the sum of, I think, nearly 15 years of qualitative research with prisoners serving very long sentences. And one of the things that really made it stand out to me, and one of the reasons I think it has gained so much attention in the academic sphere, is because of the way that it foregrounds the lived experience and the verbatim testimony of its participants as a form of lived expertise. Now, they're not the only people doing this, but they are, I think, pretty notable in the extent to which they have used prisoner testimony as a way of informing their own research. So we created a very low budget short film, and my brief was not to try and communicate the facts of the research. There are enough glorified PowerPoints out there, filmmakers who are regurgitating facts, all power to them, but that's not what I was here to do. We were here to communicate what the research felt like, because we agreed that that was the key to bringing this work to a much wider audience. And if it's okay, I'd like to show you that 3-minute film now. Small content warning, there is some bad language, and we are dealing with the verbatim testimony of prisoners discussing the traumatic experience of spending their lives in prison. So if we can play that clip, please.
So you're a few years into a life sentence. How have things changed for you over your time in prison?
I don't know, it's different now, I suppose, because obviously, like I said before, like to get through, I kind of shut myself off from the future, but moving here now it feels like a progression. It feels like, okay, like things are moving now, but in some ways it's still harder.
In what way?
Like I suppose it gives you a little bit of hope, innit?
The beginning, when you first come in, do you know what I mean? You're in jail for something serious. Like at first I thought I didn't care, like, oh fuck it, whatever, blah blah blah. You don't get on, chip on my shoulder, thinking I'm fucking out as fuck, right? You know what I mean? And then when you're in the cell, alone, and you're crying, and I'm thinking, I'm going to be in it for a long time, and I'm never ever going to get out.
Do you ever reflect on your offence?
Yeah, you know what? I've committed a crime. A terrible one. And I'm not saying I've done my time and that's that, because it don't work like that.
The first early part of the sentence, I had to completely disconnect from what I'd done. I couldn't cope. I felt self-harmed, using drugs was disruptive and destructive in my behaviour. Because I was drenched in guilt and shame.
That was the worst time of my life. I lost my head completely. It's like someone come into my cell and just turned a switch off in my head and walked back out.
And you sat there thinking, well, I'm 22, I'll be nearly 50 when I get out, won't have kids, probably won't be getting married, my family, all that, my brothers will have children that will be adults by the time I get out of here. All of that races through your mind all day and all night. And it's like a switch is broken and you can't turn it on. You go through a bit of a grieving process. You grieve for everything that's happened, but you also grieve for everything that you've lost, that will never be.
How does that feel?
I don't know.
I don't know how to describe it really,
It's kind of like unfathomable. I don't know how I'm gonna do it, like, sometimes it just feels like it's never ending. It feels like I've been in a lifetime. I've still got a lifetime to go.
you've always got a sense of guilt because you've done something.
That's the first time in my sentence I lost my head completely.
You always have a tiny bit of hope.
And it takes a while to adjust.
You're crying and you're thinking, I'm going to be in here for a long time. Grandkids, maybe. You know, I've taken all that away from her and her family and her friends.
So yeah, that's Inner Life, and I had completely forgotten that I made a little cameo in that because one of my bloody actors dropped out the day before. So I hope you can look past that and we can return to the matter at hand, which is the extraordinary opportunity that we, myself and my research partners, had to broadcast this research that was already sort of winning plaudits in the academic space, but has real potential to go further. And this film has been the fantastic vehicle for that. It is in use at the Ministry of Justice at the moment. It's being delivered as part of trying to help develop ideas around policy and thinking differently about the way that we treat long-term imprisoned people. Perhaps most significantly, it's being used to help train new prison staff, that's the word I'm looking for new staff coming into prison, but also to help with the continuing professional development of current staff, who are the people who are most proximate to the imprisoned people that the research represents, but often are quite open in saying we have no real sense of what's happening for them. You know, despite that physical proximity, there is a massive gulf of understanding, and this film is part of helping efforts to change that, and in doing so, changing the experience of serving life in prison, which is incredibly tough. It is incredibly tough. This is the next project. This is currently in pre-production, and this is with the University of Surrey. This is Dr. Adams and her team. Doing Porridge is, again, working from transcript, and we are going to be creating a verbatim narrative story based on about 130,000 words of testimony from women in prison relating to their experiences of food. It's a really significant project. It's something that is starting to get increased media attention from campaigners such as Lucy Vincent. The women's estate is much smaller than the male's estate, but it operates on the same principles, and a lot of those principles simply don't work for the female estate. They don't translate very well, and to be honest, in the male estate, they don't necessarily work very well either. So this is research that's been carried out over a slightly shorter period, but similarly longitudinal research, gathering stories, testimonies, experiences of women serving varying sentences, but looking very specifically about how food shapes their experience as women, as mothers, as criminalised people, and trying to create a different understanding about the way that food is used, both as a means of nutrition, but also as another tool of the carceral state. So that's what we're working on at the moment, and as soon as I finish this presentation, I'll be getting back to trying to get this one ready to go. So, what are we trying to do with this? Or what am I trying to do with this? I'm going to start with the conceptual stuff so I can just indulge myself and get it out the way. I think these two quotes kind of sum up my interest in the project best. It's a senior academic who I cited in a long ago master's thesis and a life prisoner from Dr. Hulley's research. And as far as I'm concerned, they're saying the same thing. Words and worlds apart, but the same sentiment come out from two very, very different life experiences. And this is where I guess my primary interest lies, in this idea of the narrative self. This is the idea that storytelling isn't just entertainment, it's not just a tool for social cohesion, but it's actually intrinsic to our ability to think, to perceive, and actually our ability to exist as conscious beings. That's as far as I would go with it. Being able to create, but also consume narratives built out of our selfhood, out of our sense of being ourselves, is, I'd argue, the absolute foundation of everything that we have built as a society. It goes beyond social organisation, as deep as self-actualisation, and Without it, I would argue we would hardly be able to make sense of the world around us, and we certainly would struggle to communicate that to anyone or anything else. And I think the irony is that as thinking, busy human beings engaged in getting on with our lives, we barely even think about it. We're barely aware that we're even doing it. And it's an amazing gift, but it also means that we can be very susceptible to the way that narratives shape us as social individuals. And my work is really, really concerned with trying to step outside of the frame in which we paint ourselves, the way that we kind of consider our existence to be limited by place, by experience, by the events that have shaped us. And being able to engage critically and with empathy in that sense of narrative, I believe is what will be absolutely fundamental to being part of social change going forward. More broadly, why this work? Why now? More practically, maybe. Well, there is a growing demand for it, particularly in academic spheres, as you might have guessed. There is an appetite for creative, innovative, accessible ways to communicate knowledge, to communicate new research findings. I also think I can say without any sort of political motivation that there is a pressing need for reform in the British judicial and penal systems, whether it's advocacy, awareness raising, or policy design. We need new narratives, new modes of engagement in order to rethink the way that we use prisons and the way that we use the justice system to shape and control society. And finally, society's evolving and culture needs to evolve with it. And as individuals in positions of privilege, of power, with access to certain technologies, materials, spaces, I would say it is our duty, but also our opportunity to create spaces for representation of unheard voices, of subjects who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to enjoy speaking freely in spaces like these. So, lastly, what does the research tell us? What story does the research tell us? And frankly, the research paints a bleak picture, but it is insightful. And what it's telling us is that there is a real-world need for this approach, very specifically in the world of the prison system. I repeat, there is an urgent need for penal reform in the UK, and I don't think that that comes with any sort of political charge. Prisons are overcrowded, conditions are absolutely terrible. The rates of suicide, self-harm, mental illness in the imprisoned community are vastly outstripping pretty much any other strand of society today. And we need to rethink how we use prisons and how we use prison sentences in our society. And if we want to change the equation on penal reform, these stories need to be told. And not only do they need to be told, but we need to be telling them with the involvement of the people experiencing these stories. And that can't just be people who have left the prison system, because some of these people will never leave the prison system. And by the time they might have qualified to leave the prison system, their experiences will be out of date. We need the experiences of people in the early years of very long sentences. We need the experiences of young people who are being convicted under things like the doctrine of joint enterprise, which some of you may have heard of, a very complex and murky set of legal doctrines that disproportionately affect certain strands of the community. We need to be talking to women serving very long sentences because their narratives are totally different from the dominant narratives, which again primarily derive from the male estate. So we need to be exploring these, we need to be trying to tell these stories, but we need to be doing it with the involvement of our participants. So this work represents an amazing opportunity to use art, technology, and creative learning to contribute to these kinds of discourses, these kinds of conversations, and hopefully agitate some sort of change through empathy and an exchange of ideas. And this is where the core idea of my talk comes from, a model of co-authorship. Now, before I go any further, I do want to address the elephant in the room, which a couple of people have mentioned to me within the studio. Is this just a question of semantics? Is this just us creating labels to make ourselves sound different enough from that other person who's doing great but very similar work in order to win funding, to get attention for our work, or just to make ourselves feel like we have something relevant to offer? I mean, I think that's a legitimate ask. Why co-authorship over co-design, co-creation, consultancy? What is it that I specifically, my research partners, what are we trying to do with this work? Well, at this point, I'm just going to say I think the language does matter. I think there are fine points of difference, and we need these labels to be able to really define our North Star when we're trying to create these pieces of work. Because without them, it would be all too easy to slip back into the habits that we're trying to overturn. So these are the principles that I've just sort of loosely fleshed out. And I should say that I'm here in a spirit of development, and I'm here in a spirit of listening and learning. I'm not here to tell you how co-authorship should work. I'm still figuring it out. And part of the reason I'm here giving this talk is to invite opportunities for ideas exchange, for criticism, for input, basically. But very briefly, I'll run you through some of the key points that I think are important. Co-authorship has to be about growing participation. So this is a circular model. This means that throughout the life cycle of any kind of co-authored project, you are giving opportunities to your partners, to your audiences, to have a say in where the project is going. Deepening engagement. This is really important within the context of our prisons work, because the work has barriers that need to be overcome, some of which are very physical and literal, and some of them are more sort of conceptual, legal, moral. We'll get onto this. But basically, the work has to engage our participants when our participants are not necessarily able to fully engage with the work for various practical, logistical reasons. And that means trying to design programs that are relevant to them, enriching for them, and meet ethical standards where there are imbalances of power. Creating platforms. That means me getting off of the soapbox and making that soapbox available to partners. It's about really keeping in mind that this is not about the creator. This is about being a facilitator and using creative tools and techniques and privileged access to tell the stories of people who demand and deserve to have their stories told. And that leads on to this idea of a non-extractive approach. This isn't just about me trying to take research, take ideas, take other people's stories, and do something with them for my own sort of creative interest. I think this is actually quite a hot button topic at the moment more broadly in media culture. There's been a lot of talk around the recent feature film May December as a real sort of melting pot for questions of what rights do we have as creatives to plunder public discourse for ideas when that public discourse actually is drawn out of real people's lives. And finally, and I'll keep this very brief because I don't want to wander too far off piece, but exploring technological possibilities as well, broadening horizons. I come from this as a filmmaker, a creative learning specialist, but there are so many more opportunities that I'm not on my own able to facilitate, and I'm here in a spirit of broadening the pool of opportunities, because ultimately that's how we will create all of these other principles. This is how we will make it relevant, this is how we will make it enriching, and this is how we will define an ethical framework for what we're trying to do. So very briefly, I just want to draw attention to a couple of examples of people who are already making great strides in this kind of work. And what we're doing is not happening in a vacuum, and we're not the only people trying to engage with this problem. I just want to draw attention to a couple of different projects that I think are really worth listening to and considering. So firstly, a feature film called Rocks. I'm sure many of you will have heard of it. Now, this isn't anything to do with the penal system, but as a model of co-authorship, I think it is almost unparalleled within recent British arts culture. Sarah Gavron, formerly a theatre maker, now a filmmaker as well, created the script along with her co-writer Teresa Ikoko by working with a group of young non-actors from the community who she was trying to represent. And that informed the development of the story, it developed the script, and eventually she cast those same young women as her lead actors. The film won a BAFTA, it was a massive success on the domestic front. I haven't seen it repeated. I haven't seen that model repeated, and I'm wondering why, because I think pretty unanimously that film was extremely well received. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is real and it is democratic in its approach. Next up, credit to a studio member for introducing me to the work of Changing Tunes. a charity using music to help people live crime-free lives. So Changing Tunes has a record label. It has bases across the UK. It works in schools and special education units. It works in prisons, and it has a suite of post-incarceration centres. I don't think I've got the term for that right, but working with people who have now been released from prison, who are trying to shape new lives outside. And music is the vehicle by which Changing Tunes gives people motivation, opportunity, and a sense of a purpose, a sense of self. Next up, if it loads, there are many theatre companies creating wonderful work in response to issues and problems within the penal system. This is one that I got the opportunity to see late last year, called Wood Hill by the Lung Theatre Company. It is a remarkable piece of work, and I would implore you to check out Lung's work if you get an opportunity. Again, that was combining personal testimony with really intense, immersive choreography. In this case, the testimony was coming from the families of men who had committed suicide in Wood Hill Prison in Milton Keynes, which is a prison I've had the opportunity to visit. And I think the enormity of the space and of the task at hand, trying to manage an environment like that, a Category A, high security prison, with limited and dwindling resources, trying to house some of the most complex and damaged and potentially risky criminals in the country. And people slip through the cracks and tragedies occur on an alarmingly regular basis. And Wood Hill was a response to that, that comes from the stories of the loved ones of people who have died. And it was an extraordinarily arresting piece. And then finally, someone from within the pervasive media studio community. Some of you might know Owen Assels. He's currently plying his trade over in the States, but before that he was supported by the Brigstow Institute to create The Process. So this was a project grounded in collaborative filmmaking with released prisoners, formerly incarcerated men, about their experiences. Owen is a friend, and he's someone who I'm hoping to work with more closely on this project going forward. And it has been really instrumental listening to him, learning from him about some of the challenges he faced in terms of negotiating access within prisons, getting equipment in and then out again from prison, and then the barriers that exist around projects that feature serving prisoners, because, often for very good reasons, we can't show or share the likenesses of serving prisoners in publicly available works. And that is one of the barriers, one of the firewalls that we need to be able to negotiate. And that is what I want to talk to you about next. The barriers that stand between us and people in prison, I like to think of in terms of firewalls. And if I can just sort of outline what I think this means. It's not impossible to access prisons or imprisoned people. There are access points, and the question is how we navigate them, how we see ourselves through the protocols that are set for us in everyone's best interest, in the interests of the state, HMPPS, who control access, in terms of the imprisoned people we're hoping to work with and whose stories we want to tell, but ultimately whose welfare we have to respect and we have to uphold at all times. And then ultimately our audiences as well, who will have varying and they will have varying levels of knowledge and access, and also varying sentiments about attempting to work with people serving very long prison sentences. A firewall, a barrier to access that operates via a defined set of rules. Now, for these purposes, they're not strictly virtual, although that's where I'm drawing the metaphor from. They can be physical, legal, moral, technological. A firewall will block what it doesn't recognize. It will permit access if its conditions are met. So the challenge is trying to negotiate the protocols of the institution whilst also not being blocked in trying to do something different, in trying to create an opportunity to say something different, to overturn received habits, received strictures, prejudices that prevent us from telling these kinds of stories. So, very briefly, again, I apologise, there is a lot of text on this page, but I'll try and run through some of the prison firewalls that I'm aware of. Practical firewalls. Prisons are hard to access. There's a lot of paperwork that needs to be jumped through. They are sometimes logistically quite tricky to reach, and arranging a visit is not straightforward. Virtual firewalls. Prisons are closed loops by and large, and communication, even when it's legitimate, is very tightly policed. There are good reasons for that, but it means that we can't just set up a Zoom call with a participant group. We can't just organise things via Slack. We can't even create WhatsApp groups, obviously. Although plenty of prisoners do have phones, we absolutely can't be the ones sending them text messages. Something that was raised when I was piloting this talk with studio members was the issue of literacy. So digital literacy, but also more traditional ideas of literacy, reading levels, abilities to write, abilities to, sustain critical engagement, because fundamentally these are often things that people within the imprisoned community struggle with, and that's just that is a fact. That's not prejudicial, not intentionally at least. It's simply something that you have to be aware of, that you're going to be working with people who haven't necessarily had the best or the most straightforward course in life, and that will include a major limitation of their educational opportunities. If they've been in prison for a long time, they may not know how to access the technologies that you're hoping to use with them, and you have to be able to foster that with respect, but also make it accessible to everyone involved. Moving on from that is hardware. Any equipment brought into prisons is subject to extreme scrutiny. They will check absolutely everything, and anything that they can't put a serial number to, they won't let you have it in. Once you've brought it in, sometimes they won't let you have it back out. I think this is a problem that Owain had when he was creating some film work with imprisoned people, brought cameras into a prison and then wasn't allowed to have them back out. They're now in the system permanently, and thank goodness it wasn't his personal kit. Someone else was paying for it. Representation. Representation can mean a lot of different things. In this case, I'm thinking specifically about the optics of working in prison, with prisons, with prison providers, because not all prisons are run by the state. Participatory projects are often regarded with a lot of scrutiny, a lot of suspicion, a lot of skepticism, because they are an outside force. They are a foreign body, and they can be disruptive to the daily life of a prison, and anything that is disruptive is generally suppressed, because maintaining order and control is one of the fundamental tenets of running a stable prison. All of our work involves getting the approval of His Majesty's Prison Probation Service. Antagonising HMPPS is extremely unwise if you want to have any sort of sustainable practice. Finally, safeguarding and duty of care. That involves the prisons themselves, involves the people who are working in prison, but it also involves our audiences, it involves the public. We do have to think very, very carefully about whether it is our right to tell a story without thinking about the consequences, without thinking about the impacts, both on the welfare of a prisoner, who we may not be able to go back and check in on, whose psychological well-being may be reliant on an overstretched in-house prison psychologist or a medic who isn't fully aware of what's going on. We don't have the opportunity to do follow-up in the way that we would try to do with participants in a mainstream situation, but also to the public. There are good reasons that we shouldn't be just showing prisoners' faces and voices willy-nilly in the public, because there are people whose lives they have affected, and part of their incarceration is to protect the public from that affect. We have to acknowledge that, we have to respect it, we have to think very carefully about how we negotiate that. These aren't insurmountable, but they are the basis for all of the questions that I'm asking today. They are the barriers that we have to negotiate in order to do the kind of work that we want to do. And then there are some more sort of conceptual questions, and I think we're running a little bit short of time, so I'm not going to dwell on these for too long, but these are the sort of the more sort of like theoretical questions that I'm also throwing around at the moment, and they're things that I would be very interested to know other people's opinions on. The question of stereotypes versus archetypes. So this is coming from my interest in narrative selves and the way that we tell our own stories, the way that we tell stories socially. I don't know if you all share my kind of fascination with the specificity of language and labeling, but this is a real example of where in social conversations, a stereotype can be very harmful and damaging, whilst I would say an archetype, whilst looking very similar, can be very important for being able to communicate ideas. Stereotypes we often think of as being laboured, tired, they draw out the sort of the lowest common denominator of an identity, and they are slapped across individuals without any kind of respect for their individual experience or identity. An archetype, I would argue, is something that can be used to build a new kind of narrative. It can be used to build a different kind of story. And as I've said, I think storytelling is something that we can't get away from. We're constantly using narratives to try and communicate ideas about places that you've never been or places that I've never heard of, and I'm listening and learning from you. And I have to do that by finding those iconic points, those tropes, those key metaphors that spark an idea in your mind about the experience of being in prison. I think this is an interesting example. This is Jimmy McGovern's latest season of Time, which is a really, really good TV show. It's a really good narrative representation of a women's prison. But you can see, these are the three protagonists. These are the three strands of storyline that the second series focuses on. The first series focused on a single man going into jail for the first time. This focuses on three different women who have to be, for the sake of the story, representative of three different parts of the female estate. Now, does it work in the story's detriment that these women become archetypal of a certain kind of prisoner? Or are they stereotypes of a certain kind of prisoner, a certain kind of woman? Does it matter? Is it something that we can avoid? Do we have to lean into these archetypes in order to be able to tell these stories? Because maybe the first good is simply telling the story and creating these problems in the social conversation. Maybe we just need to have the problem in order to have the conversation. But it's something that I'm thinking about as I'm trying to come into this space. How do I tell the story of a group of people with all the kind of fineness and detail and texture of their lives without identifying individuals, without fixating on the subjective experience of an individual, which may or may not be shared or even endorsed by other people? It's a live and febrile question. Next, truth versus accuracy. This is a real favourite of mine, and I think some people, they look at this and they scratch their head. What's the difference between truth and accuracy? Does it really matter? Are we going really down the semantic rabbit hole? Now, I think it does matter. This is an advert that was recently used for recruitment to HMPPS, and it is meant to be a sort of a day in the life of a member of prison staff. And the ad attempts to show, in the space of 15 seconds, because that's all they get when they're doing a social spot, all the things that could be happening, trying to create this sense of the intensity of what it's like to be a prison officer, all the things you're having to deal with, all the different priorities you're having to hold in your head. Now, I think it's fair to say that this is not a particularly accurate representation of what day-to-day life is, even on quite a challenging, rowdy landing. These things are not all happening at once, and it does almost like in isolation start to become a little bit ridiculous. But the intention of the ad isn't to show necessarily an accurate representation of what can be a very isolating and quite a dull job, according to some prison officers that you speak to. But it's trying to capture in a snapshot, in a glimpse, all the different things that could be going on, and that sense of the pressure that prison officers are under, and the importance of the work that they do, like managing the expectations and the needs of all these different people, their colleagues, very challenging prisoners, very vulnerable prisoners. And in that sense, it's not an accurate representation, but it is truthful. And that's something that is really important to me. How are we communicating interior truth? Not necessarily how do we create pure representative accuracy? Because ultimately that's an outsider's view looking in, and I'm interested in insiders looking and speaking out. So the last one, very briefly. I hope I've given you a bit of a sense that I'm thinking about the words I'm using and the problems that are facing us, and that is something that has to carry on through the entire life of a project like this. we have to be the best filters of our own work. And we won't always be. We will fail, we will get it wrong, we will make mistakes, and I'm really hoping that I'm not going to get an email from my collaborators after this telling me about all the mistakes that I've made. But if I did, then it's my duty as the facilitator and the convener of this project to take that on board, to listen to it, to respect it, and if necessary, to change what we're doing. And that spirit, this is going back to one of the very first points we made about what co-authorship is, this idea of a circular model, the idea that this has to be accessible and ready for input at every stage of the project's life cycle. And we have to be able to be open to that, to welcome it, to accept it, and to learn from it. And frankly, that's not always the case. It's something that we've discussed, myself and other people within the studio, sort of in one-to-one settings. It's like, how do you keep the momentum and keep the focus on a creative output without at some point having to leave behind the things that have influenced it? And when those things are real people, and not just real people, but real people whose stories you are trying to harness, to manipulate in order to create, you know, an artistic response, is there an ethical duty of care to those participants at every step of the process, or does there come a point where the product comes first? It probably differs from project to project. It probably differs from participant to participant, but there is no one template that you can just take and then run with and then assume that those questions are answered, that box is ticked. You have to make it a live and ongoing concern. And there are plenty of other iterations of this question all the way through the process, and I hope that I've outlined some of them in brief. So to conclude, having set out earlier in this talk my very early stabs at what a model of co-authorship might be, I want to finish on some of the principles that I've settled on so far. And again, these are open to interpretation, to discussion, to critique. But the reason that co-authorship, I would say, is different from, say, co-design or consultation or co-production sort of stems from here. For a start, it's about storytelling, and the modes of telling our own stories have to remain of fundamental importance throughout the co-authorship process. It exists on a spectrum, I would say. Authorship is not the same as design, it's not the same as production, and you know, the role of an author on a very sort of like a textual sense, you know, what is an author in terms of the book or the play or the script that they write is one question, but also what is the author as the salesperson for their work, as an advocate for their work, as the political representative of their characters who sometimes will convey ideas and sentiments that are completely contrary to the author's own. How do you negotiate that challenge in the world? It's a process. Co-authorship is a process of communication, first and foremost, of exploration, of creating responses to ideas, to exchanges. It's different from production in the sense that it can lead to the production of, you know, an artwork, a film, a text. But I would say it's quite important to remember that co-authorship is not the same as those things. The process of authorship, of, you know, anybody who has written or, you know, has functioned as an author in any sort of space, I think would probably agree there is almost an entirely separate process of coming to terms with your own thoughts and your own perspectives on the world, on the situation at hand, and trying to figure out what on earth is it that I'm trying to say? What is it that I want to say? And what is it that I want people to hear? And that, for me, is at the heart of what co-authorship is. And that has quite a practical outcome as well. Thinking back to those early principles that I was talking about, this has to be enriching and relevant to the participants in this co-authorship process who aren't all creatives. They're not all coming at it with this creative bent and this desire to have, I don't know, a film shown in the cinema in my case, or, you know, an art exhibition at a leading London gallery that features, you know, the paintings of imprisoned people, as has happened with Dr. Adams and her Doing Porridge colleagues. They have been part of creating this wonderful work, painted and created in sculpture by imprisoned people, shown in public venues, but not being enjoyed by the prisoners themselves because that work is now out in the world. And that's not a criticism of that particular project, but it is something that we've got to recognise. That art has been put out into the world for public exhibition, and it's no longer available to imprisoned participants. So what's in it for them? Co-authorship is defined by voice. And I think this is a little bit of a summation of some of the other points. When I'm writing funding bids for film work especially, there's a lot of talk about the voice of the project, the voice of the writer-director. And that's more than just the language you use or the experiences you've had or the narrative you're trying to tell. It's something a little bit more facile than that. It's something that makes what you have to say relevant to the here and now. It's a kind of self-aware kind of communication that asks, why am I saying this? And who am I saying it on behalf of? Who is speaking? Who is doing the speaking? Who is allowed to speak? And how, where, or when can that voice be heard? And I think those sorts of questions have to become, they have to be brought back to the fundament of any kind of co-authorship project, because fundamentally, as the creator, as the creative lead, I have to remind myself all the time I'm a facilitator, and no matter how excited or enthusiastic I get about the creative outcomes, they aren't the core of the process. As we've already said, it is about the exchange, it's about the communication, the exploration, what we listen to and what we learn. And ultimately, co-authorship is about voices, and it's about the people who use those voices and the people who speak. And that makes it a political act. And as a result, a co-authorship project can never be conducted in a vacuum. It must always be aware of, it must confront, it must address the imbalances, be they political, practical, or power-based, that it exists within. And I think if we can find a way of conceptualizing that, containing it, and carrying it forward into the work that we do, with individuals who have every right to be telling their own stories, but don't necessarily have the tools or the venues or the resources to be going and telling their own stories themselves, then we can take the first steps towards creating work that can have a meaningful and relevant and enriching impact on society. I'll leave it there. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. We are at 2 o'clock, but I think we probably have time for one quick question. George. Oh, yes. Here at the back. Sorry. Yeah.
If you just speak into the mic, it doesn't have any voice.
Thanks very much, George. That's really interesting presentation. I was interested in the use of art that you mentioned. I can see you using the sound, ambient sound, and jump cuts, and so on in the editing to create impact. I'm wondering about the potential of extending that into visual interpretation of the metaphors that the prisoners may use in their transcript as a way out of talking heads. Yes. In short, I think that's absolutely the way to think about it, and I'm really glad you noticed, so thanks. Aesthetics is, the aesthetics of imprisonment and confinement is really at the heart of what I can bring to these sorts of projects. And through film, I'm really interested in sound design. I'm interested in the disconnect between what we see and what we hear, in creating senses of rupture and disconnect. And really interesting that you draw out, actually, that sense of metaphor being derived from participants. It's not something I really had a chance to go into here, but there are key tropes and metaphors that the participants keep referring to, especially stuff about weight and water. It's really, really fascinating how many imprisoned people use concepts around water, whether it's swimming or drowning or treading water or a sense of saturation, to articulate the process, and it is a process of life imprisonment. You change over time, and your state in that watery body, for instance, changes. That's also part of the reason that I don't want to just confine this to cinema. That's my first base, that's what I know best. It's not where I want to stay, it's not where these projects will flourish best. So I am very, very open to the way that we can bring aesthetics, we can bring other creative artistic concepts to bear, and also how we can draw those back out from participant experience.
All right, I think we are at time, so I'm going to say thank you to George, but George, you are hanging around for a bit?
Yes, I'll be around all day. So
all right, great.
Thank you.
So thank you, George. All right, before you all go, please don't forget that today is First Friday. So from 5 to 6 p.m. today, we've got our monthly social event. Come along, grab a drink, and see some of the work that people in our community have been making. If you want to stick around before that in Hot Desk, find out more about what we do, please come find one of the studio team. Studio team, give us a wave. Here we are. Nick has remembered this time. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for putting up with the technical issues at the start, and we'll see you all again next time.